On a sweltering August night in 1856, Reverend Elias Thornfield vanished from his locked study in Charleston's most prestigious church, leaving behind only a bloodstained Bible and a cryptic note that read, "The congregation demands its sacrifice. The covenant must be honored." For over a century and 60 years, the Charleston diocese has kept the true circumstances of his disappearance buried in sealed archives. But recently discovered letters reveal a conspiracy so disturbing that it shook the very foundations of Southern society. What happened to the man who preached to senators and slave owners alike was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The investigation that followed was deliberately sabotaged. Witnesses mysteriously died or disappeared, and evidence was systematically destroyed by some of Charleston's most powerful families. Before we continue with the story of Reverend Thornfield and the dark secrets that consumed Charleston's elite, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across America. The stories we uncover often hit closer to home than you might expect. The truth about that humid August evening would expose a web of corruption, forbidden desires, and deadly ambition that reached into the highest echelons of Charleston society, involving federal senators, Supreme Court justices, and banking dynasties whose names still grace Charleston's most prestigious streets today. Charleston in 1856 stood as the crown jewel of the antebellum South, its cobblestone streets lined with grand mansions that housed some of the wealthiest families in America. The city's economy thrived on rice, cotton, and the brutal machinery of slavery, creating a society where appearances mattered more than souls, and reputation could determine life or death. The smell of jasmine and magnolia blossoms couldn't quite mask the underlying stench of human misery that permeated the slave markets, while the sound of church bells competed with the cries of auctioneers selling human flesh. St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church rose majestically on Meeting Street, its Gothic spires piercing the humid sky like accusatory fingers pointing toward heaven. The church had been built in 1848 with funds donated by Charleston's most powerful families, the Ravenels, who controlled the largest rice plantations in the Low Country, the Pinckneys, whose legal dynasty had shaped South Carolina's constitution, the Retts, whose political influence extended all the way to Washington. These were men who controlled not just vast plantations worked by thousands of enslaved souls, but the very pulse of Southern politics and commerce. Within these hallowed walls, deals were struck that would determine the fate of entire congressional districts. Marriages were arranged that would consolidate family fortunes worth millions, and secrets were buried deeper than any grave in the church's ancient cemetery. The pews were assigned according to strict social hierarchy. The front rows reserved for families whose ancestors had signed the Declaration of Independence, the middle sections for successful merchants and professionals, and the back areas for the city's working class and those whose social standing remained questionable. Reverend Elias Thornfield had arrived in Charleston 3 years earlier from Richmond, Virginia, carrying impeccable credentials and letters of recommendation from some of the most influential families in the Old Dominion. His previous position at St. Paul's in Richmond had ended abruptly under circumstances that were never fully explained, though whispered rumors suggested some sort of scandal involving a prominent family's daughter. The Richmond diocese had been eager to provide him with a new position far from Virginia, and Charleston's vestry had been impressed by his scholarly reputation and magnetic presence. At 38, Thornfield possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance and magnetic charisma that drew both men and women to hang on his every word. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with piercing blue eyes and prematurely silver hair that gave him an appearance of distinguished wisdom beyond his years. His voice carried the refined cadences of Virginia aristocracy, but with an underlying intensity that made even the most hardened plantation owners feel as though he could see directly into their souls. His sermons packed St. Bartholomew's to capacity every Sunday, with carriages lining the streets as far as Broad Street. Politicians would reschedule important meetings to attend his services, and prominent families from as far away as Savannah would make the journey to Charleston specifically to hear him preach. His reputation for eloquence was matched only by his apparent gift for understanding the deepest spiritual needs of his congregation. But Thornfield was more than just a gifted orator. Within months of his arrival, he had cultivated himself as confessor to Charleston's elite, the keeper of their deepest secrets and darkest sins. In the privacy of his study, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the city's most powerful men unburdened themselves of guilt that would have destroyed their carefully constructed lives if revealed to the public. Dr. Edmund Rutledge, descendant of one of South Carolina's founding families and one of the most respected physicians in the South, had become one of Thornfield's most frequent visitors. Rutledge owned not only a thriving medical practice, but also controlled several of the city's most profitable businesses, including a discreet establishment on Magnolia Street that catered to the particular needs of wealthy gentlemen. His wife, Margaret, a delicate woman of impeccable breeding, remained blissfully unaware of her husband's diverse business interests. Judge Hamilton Crenshaw, whose courtroom decisions could make or break entire families, had also fallen under Thornfield's influence. Crenshaw's reputation for incorruptible justice was legendary throughout South Carolina, but behind closed doors, he struggled with gambling debts that threatened to expose his family to financial ruin. The judge's weekly visits to Thornfield's study had become as regular as Sunday service itself. Senator Robert Barnwell, one of the most powerful men in Washington and a fierce advocate for Southern interests, had been spotted entering the church at odd hours, always alone and always with the furtive manner of a man carrying dangerous secrets. Barnwell's political future depended on maintaining his image as a moral paragon, but whispers in Charleston's drawing rooms suggested that his rise to power had involved compromises that would shock even his most cynical supporters. The summer of 1856 had been particularly oppressive, with yellow fever threatening the city and political tensions reaching a fever pitch over the expansion of slavery into new territories. The air itself seemed poisoned with anxiety and fear, as families fled to their summer homes in the mountains, and those who remained spoke in hushed tones about omens and portents. Street vendors reported that their usual customers had grown pale and nervous, jumping at every unexpected sound. August 23rd, 1856, began like any other sweltering Charleston day, with the oppressive heat rising from the harbor and settling over the city like a suffocating blanket. The temperature had reached 98 degrees by noon, and even the usually bustling Market Street had grown quiet as people sought shelter from the brutal sun. Dogs lay panting in whatever shade they could find, and the city's famous wrought iron balconies became furnaces that no one dared touch. Thornfield had spent the morning in his study, preparing for evening vespers and meeting with parishioners who sought his counsel. Sarah Beaumont, the church secretary who had served St. Bartholomew's for 15 years, noticed he seemed unusually distracted, repeatedly checking the ornate gold pocket watch that had been given to him by a mysterious benefactor the previous Christmas. The watch bore an inscription in Latin that Sarah had never been able to decipher, though she had noticed that Thornfield often fingered it during moments of deep contemplation. Throughout the day, a steady stream of Charleston's elite had visited the church, each requesting private audiences with Thornfield. Sarah had observed that these meetings were different from his usual pastoral counseling sessions. The visitors arrived looking anxious and departed, looking even more troubled. Cornelius Fitzhugh, the tobacco merchant whose business dealings extended from Charleston to Liverpool, had emerged from one such meeting with his face flushed and his hands trembling so badly he could barely light his customary cigar. As the sun began its descent toward the Ashley River, casting long shadows across the churchyard filled with the graves of Charleston's founding families, Thornfield dismissed Sarah earlier than usual. "I have important matters to attend to this evening," he told her, his voice carrying an unfamiliar tremor that sent chills down her spine, despite the oppressive heat. "Please ensure I'm not disturbed under any circumstances. Lock the main doors behind you and tell anyone who inquires that the church is closed for private contemplation. Sarah had worked for the church long enough to recognize when something was seriously amiss. Thornfield's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled agitation, and she noticed that his hands shook slightly as he arranged papers on his desk. Most unnervingly, he had spent several minutes staring at a daguerreotype photograph that he kept locked in his desk drawer. An image she had glimpsed once, showing 13 men in formal dress, standing around what appeared to be an altar of some kind. At 7:30, as the church bells chimed across the city, calling the faithful to evening prayers at other parishes, 3 men arrived at St. Bartholomew's. Sarah, who had lingered in the vestry to finish filing correspondence, recognized them immediately through the Gothic windows: Dr. Rutledge, Judge Crenshaw, and tobacco merchant Cornelius Fitzhugh. All 3 were prominent vestry members, pillars of Charleston society, whose families had helped build the very church they now entered with such obvious reluctance. But tonight, their faces bore expressions she had never seen before. A mixture of determination and barely concealed fear that transformed their usually confident bearing into something almost furtive. Dr. Rutledge kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting to be followed, while Judge Crenshaw clutched a leather satchel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Fitzhugh appeared to be muttering prayers under his breath, his lips moving in silent supplication. They disappeared into Thornfield's study without acknowledging Sarah's presence, and she heard the heavy oak door close with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty church like a death knell. For the next hour and a half, Sarah could hear the low murmur of intense conversation, punctuated by occasional raised voices that carried an urgency she had never heard in normal church business discussions. At one point, around 8:40, she distinctly heard Dr. Rutledge shout, "You cannot ask this of us, Elias, not after everything we've built. Not after all we've sacrificed to reach this point." The response was muffled, but Thornfield's tone carried a coldness that made Sarah's blood freeze despite the evening's stifling humidity. She caught fragments of his reply: "Covenant demands completion, and price was agreed upon. And most chillingly, your souls are already forfeit." Judge Crenshaw's voice rose next, cracking with what sounded like desperation. "There must be another way. Surely the Lord would not demand such a sacrifice from his faithful servants." Thornfield's laughter in response was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard from the man, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity that seemed to echo from some deep, dark place within his soul. The conversation grew more heated as the evening progressed, with Fitzhugh's distinctive voice joining the argument. "The yellow fever has already taken dozens. Can't we claim it was the pestilence? No one would question another death from the fever." But Thornfield's response was implacable. "The covenant specifies the manner and timing. There can be no substitutions, no delays, no mercy for the weak of heart." At 9:15, the study door finally opened, and the 3 men emerged into the candlelit church, their faces ashen and their movements unsteady. Judge Crenshaw's hands shook so violently that he struggled to light his pipe, dropping several matches before finally succeeding in producing a weak flame. Fitzhugh kept glancing back toward the study door as if expecting something terrible to emerge, while repeatedly making the sign of the cross in a manner that seemed more protective than devotional. "Dada." Rutledge approached Sarah with forced composure, but she could see perspiration beading on his forehead despite the evening's slight cooling, and noticed that his usually immaculate clothing was disheveled. His medical bag, which he always carried, seemed heavier than usual, as though it contained more than his normal instruments. "Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an underlying tremor, "Reverend Thornfield will be working late this evening on matters of utmost spiritual importance. He's asked not to be disturbed under any circumstances. You should go home now and ensure that no one enters the church until morning service." His tone carried an authority that brooked no argument, but Sarah noticed that his eyes couldn't quite meet hers, and his words seemed rehearsed, as though he had practiced them carefully. As the three men departed into the Charleston night, their carriage wheels echoing hollowly on the cobblestones, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over the church like a physical presence. The gas lamps flickered in their sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life across the Gothic arches and religious frescoes that normally provided comfort to troubled souls. She waited another 30 minutes, her anxiety growing with each passing moment, before gathering her courage to check on Thornfield one final time. The study door remained locked, but she could see light seeping beneath it and hear what sounded like pages turning and the scratch of a pen on paper. Occasionally, she caught the sound of what might have been prayer, but the words were in a language she didn't recognize. Certainly not Latin or English, but something that seemed to carry an inherent darkness that made her skin crawl. Pressing her ear to the heavy oak door, she heard Thornfield's voice rising and falling in what sounded like an incantation, punctuated by long periods of silence. At one point, she could have sworn she heard other voices responding to his, though she knew he was alone in the room. The temperature near the door seemed unnaturally cold, as though something was drawing all warmth from the surrounding air. Something was wrong, terribly, devastatingly wrong. And Sarah Beaumont knew that whatever was happening in that locked study would change Charleston forever. The next morning brought Charleston's worst fears to reality, though the full extent of the horror would not be understood for decades. When Sarah arrived at St. Bartholomew's for morning service preparation, she found Thornfield's study still locked from the inside, with no response to her increasingly frantic knocking. The sexton, old Marcus Webb, who had served the church for 40 years and had keys to every door in the building, was summoned with trembling hands to unlock the mystery that awaited them. Marcus Webb was a man who had seen much in his 4 decades of service to Charleston's elite. But nothing had prepared him for what they discovered when that heavy oak door finally swung open. The study was empty of human life, but the scene that greeted them would haunt Charleston for generations and drive both Sarah and Marcus to their graves carrying secrets too terrible to share. Thornfield was gone, vanished as completely as if he had never existed. But the manner of his disappearance defied all logic, reason, and natural law. The windows remained locked from the inside, their heavy wooden shutters latched securely with iron bars that showed no signs of tampering. The door through which they had entered was the only way in or out of the room, and it had been locked from the inside with a key that now lay on Thornfield's desk, beside a scene that made Sarah's knees buckle with horror. His Bible lay open on the mahogany desk, its pages stained with what appeared to be fresh blood that had not yet dried, despite the passage of an entire night. The crimson stains formed patterns across the sacred text that seemed almost deliberate, as though someone had used the blood to underline specific passages about sacrifice, covenant, and the price of spiritual power. Beside the defiled Bible, written in Thornfield's unmistakable handwriting, but in ink that appeared to be the same dark red as the blood, was a note that made Sarah's blood run cold. The congregation demands its sacrifice. The covenant must be honored. The 13 have become 12, but the work continues. E.T. Most disturbing of all was the state of the room itself, which showed clear evidence of some sort of ritual or ceremony having taken place. Every drawer in Thornfield's massive mahogany desk had been pulled out and emptied, but not in the chaotic manner of a burglary. Instead, the contents were arranged in neat piles on the Persian carpet, correspondence sorted by date, financial records organized by category, and most unnervingly, a collection of sealed envelopes bearing the names of Charleston's most prominent families arranged in a perfect circle around the desk chair. In the center of this circle, where Thornfield's chair should have been, was a dark stain on the carpet that Marcus Webb recognized immediately as blood. Far too much blood for any person to lose and survive. The stain formed a perfect circle, as though someone had stood in the center and allowed their life to drain away in a deliberate, ritualistic manner. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what appeared to be ceremonial implements arranged on the bookshelf behind the desk. A silver chalice that Sarah recognized as belonging to the church's communion service sat beside an ornate dagger that neither she nor Marcus had ever seen before. The dagger's blade was stained with the same dark substance that marked the Bible and carpet, while strange symbols were carved into its ivory handle. The investigation that followed was swift, limited, and deliberately obstructed by forces that extended far beyond Charleston's city limits. Judge Crenshaw himself took charge of the inquiry, declaring that the matter required delicate handling due to the sensitive nature of the Reverend's pastoral duties and the need to protect the privacy of his counseling relationships. Dr. Rutledge served as the medical examiner, despite the obvious conflict of interest and the absence of a body to examine. The official conclusion, reached with suspicious speed, was that Reverend Thornfield had suffered some form of mental breakdown brought on by the oppressive heat and the spiritual burden of ministering to Charleston's elite during these troubling political times. The blood on the Bible was attributed to a severe nosebleed caused by stress and dehydration, while his disappearance was explained as a case of sudden departure due to a family emergency in Virginia that required immediate and secret attention. The story released to the Charleston Mercury and other local papers was even simpler. Reverend Thornfield had received urgent word that his elderly mother in Richmond was dying and had departed immediately to be at her bedside. His belongings would be forwarded when convenient, and a suitable replacement would be found as soon as possible. The church would continue normal operations under the temporary guidance of the vestry. But those closest to the investigation knew that something far more sinister had occurred. Marcus Webb, who had seen the inside of that study, confided to his wife in whispered conversations that he had never seen men more frightened than the vestry members in the days following Thornfield's disappearance. Dr. Rutledge aged what appeared to be a decade in a single week, his thick black hair turning completely gray almost overnight. Judge Crenshaw began drinking heavily, often seen stumbling from taverns along East Bay Street in the early morning hours, muttering about prices paid and covenants honored. Sarah Beaumont, despite her 15 years of faithful service to the church, was encouraged to take an extended leave of absence to recover from the shock of discovering the scene. When she attempted to return after a month, she found that her position had been filled by a young woman from Columbia who had no knowledge of the events surrounding Thornfield's disappearance and had been specifically instructed never to discuss the previous secretary or ask questions about the church's recent history. Most tellingly, all three men who had met with Thornfield that final night suddenly found compelling reasons to leave Charleston, despite their deep roots in the community and their extensive business and political interests. Dr. Rutledge accepted a position in Richmond, claiming that his wife Margaret's delicate constitution required a change of climate for her health. He sold his medical practice and all his Charleston property at significant losses, departing the city with such haste that he left behind valuable medical equipment and personal possessions. Judge Crenshaw announced his retirement from the bench after 25 years of distinguished service, citing exhaustion and a desire to spend his remaining years in quiet contemplation on his family's plantation in Georgia. His departure was so abrupt that he left several important cases unresolved, causing chaos in Charleston's legal system that took months to sort out. Cornelius Fitzhugh's departure was the most dramatic of all. He sold his tobacco business, which had been built over 3 generations and was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, to a competitor for a fraction of its value. He then disappeared entirely from Charleston society, with rumors suggesting he had fled to California or possibly South America. His wife and children were left to deal with creditors and unanswered questions about why a successful businessman would abandon everything so suddenly. As weeks turned to months, strange occurrences began plaguing St. Bartholomew's and the surrounding neighborhood. The new reverend, a nervous young man named Jonathan Pierce from North Carolina, complained of feeling watched during his sermons, as though unseen eyes were judging every word he spoke. He reported that the temperature in Thornfield's former study fluctuated wildly, sometimes becoming so cold that frost formed on the windows even during the height of summer. Parishioners began reporting disturbing experiences during services, cold spots that moved through the church like invisible presences, the sound of whispered conversations coming from empty pews, and most unnervingly, the distinct impression that someone was standing behind them during prayers, close enough that they could feel breath on their necks. The church's financial records showed mysterious donations appearing monthly, always in the exact amount of Thornfield's former salary. But no donor could be identified despite extensive investigation. The money arrived in cash, left anonymously in the collection box, with notes written in a handwriting that no one could identify, but that bore an unsettling resemblance to Thornfield's distinctive script. The truth about Elias Thornfield's disappearance remained buried for decades, protected by a conspiracy of silence that extended from Charleston's drawing rooms to the halls of Congress in Washington. But secrets have a way of clawing their way back to the surface, especially when they involve the kinds of sins that poison bloodlines and curse entire families for generations. In the winter of 1889, 33 years after that fateful August night, a discovery would crack open the carefully constructed wall of silence that Charleston's elite had built around the incident. The discovery came through the most mundane of circumstances. A renovation project that would expose horrors beyond anything the contractors had been hired to address. During extensive renovations of the Rutledge family mansion on South Battery, one of Charleston's most prestigious addresses, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall in what had been Dr. Edmund Rutledge's private study. The compartment had been concealed with such skill that it had remained undetected for over 3 decades, even during previous renovation work and the sale of the house following Dr. Rutledge's death in 1871. Inside the hidden space, wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth and preserved with the kind of care usually reserved for sacred relics, was a collection of documents that would have destroyed half of Charleston's leading families in 1856, and might still pose a threat to their descendants decades later. The papers included detailed correspondence, financial records, and most damning of all, photographic evidence of activities that violated not only the laws of South Carolina, but the fundamental moral principles upon which Southern society claimed to be built. The documents revealed that Elias Thornfield had been far more than just an ambitious clergyman seeking to expand his influence among Charleston's elite. He had been the mastermind of an intricate web of blackmail, extortion, and conspiracy that stretched from Charleston to Richmond, from Washington to New Orleans, involving some of the most powerful men in the antebellum South. Among the most damning pieces of evidence was a series of letters dated throughout 1855 and 1856, addressed to various Charleston luminaries and written in Thornfield's precise, educated handwriting. These were not the pastoral letters one might expect from a minister to his congregation, but rather the cold, calculated communications of a master blackmailer who had spent years gathering information that could destroy lives, families, and political careers with surgical precision. One letter, dated August 15, 1856, just 8 days before Thornfield's disappearance, was addressed to Dr. Rutledge and revealed the true nature of their relationship. My dear Edmund, your continued resistance to our arrangement is both disappointing and dangerous to all concerned. The photographic evidence I possess of your activities at the Magnolia Street establishment would not only ruin your medical reputation, but would likely cause your dear wife Margaret's delicate constitution to suffer a collapse from which she might never recover. More importantly, the documentation of your involvement in the illegal importation of opium from Charleston's Chinese Quarter would result in federal charges that would see you imprisoned for the remainder of your natural life. Senator Barnwell has already agreed to our terms regarding the federal land appropriations in the territories. Judge Crenshaw understands perfectly the consequences of refusing to ensure favorable verdicts in the Morrison slave uprising trials. I trust you will reconsider your position regarding the yellow fever medication supplies and the special arrangements we discussed. The Lord's work requires sacrifice from all his servants, and the covenant demands completion. Your eternal soul, along with those of your fellow participants, hangs in the balance. E.T. The letter revealed not only the scope of Thornfield's blackmail operation, but also hinted at something far more sinister, some sort of spiritual or occult covenant that bound his victims to him in ways that went beyond simple extortion. The reference to eternal souls and completion suggested that Thornfield believed he was engaged in something more significant than mere earthly corruption. Another document in the collection was even more revealing. A leather-bound ledger that listed the names of over 40 Charleston luminaries alongside cryptic entries that detailed their crimes and the prices they paid to keep them secret. The entries read like a catalogue of human depravity. BR. Cotton futures manipulation through federal contacts, $500 a month. HC. Jury tampering in capital cases, acquittal guarantees, $300 a month. PM. Slave breeding documentation and trafficking records, ongoing protection. WS. Federal postal contracts fraud, revenue splitting arrangement. But the ledger revealed that Thornfield's operation went far beyond simple blackmail for financial gain. The money he collected was being funneled toward something called the Sacred Works Fund, with detailed accounting that showed massive expenditures for ritual materials, ceremonial requirements, and most disturbing of all, acquisition costs for covenant participants. Tucked between the pages of the ledger was a membership roster for something called the Covenant of Solomon, listing 13 names including Thornfield's own at the top as High Priest and Master of Ceremonies. The other 12 names included Dr. Rutledge, Judge Crenshaw, and Cornelius Fitzhugh, but also revealed the participation of men whose involvement would have shocked Charleston society even more. Senator Robert Barnwell, Federal Judge William Manning, Charleston Mayor Patrick Hennessy, and several others whose families remained prominent in Charleston circles decades later. Below the names was a chilling motto written in both English and what appeared to be Hebrew. Through sacrifice, we achieve dominion. Through dominion, we achieve immortality. Through immortality, we transcend the laws of God and man. The roster was dated 1854, just 2 years after Thornfield's arrival in Charleston, suggesting that he had spent considerable time identifying and recruiting his participants. Beside each name was a date and a cryptic notation. Initiated through confession of the Morrison affair. Bound through evidence of the federal contract fraud. Secured through photographic documentation. It became clear that Thornfield had used his position as confessor and his network of informants to identify men whose secrets made them vulnerable to coercion, then systematically recruited them into whatever dark purpose drove his covenant. The final document in the collection was perhaps the most disturbing. A detailed floor plan of Charleston's old slave market, with specific chambers marked for what were described as covenant rituals and sacred works. The plan showed that the market's public areas were only a small portion of the building. Beneath the main floor was an extensive network of underground chambers that had been modified for purposes that had nothing to do with the legal slave trade. Dates spanning from 1854 to 1856 were penciled in the margins, with notations about subjects acquired, ceremonies completed, and covenant obligations fulfilled. The most recent entry, dated August 20th, 1856, just 3 days before Thornfield's disappearance, reads simply, "Final sacrifice prepared, covenant completion scheduled, the master's hour approaches." Martha Rutledge, Dr. Edmund's granddaughter, who had inherited the mansion along with the burden of her family's dark history, brought the documents to her attorney with hands that shook from more than just age. She was a woman in her 60s who had grown up hearing whispered stories about her grandfather's mysterious final years, how he had withdrawn from Charleston society and spent his last decade in what the family politely called religious contemplation and charitable works. Now she understood the true nature of his torment and the source of the nightmares that had plagued the Rutledge family for generations. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The attorney Martha Rutledge consulted was Charles Pemberton, a practical man who had built his reputation on discretion and his fortune on keeping Charleston's elite families out of scandal. He had handled divorces, business disputes, and criminal matters for 3 generations of prominent families. But even his experienced eye was shocked by what the Rutledge documents revealed. After spending 3 days reviewing the papers in the privacy of his office, Pemberton advised Martha to burn them immediately and never speak of their contents to another living soul. "Some secrets," he told her, his voice grave with the weight of years spent protecting the powerful, "are too dangerous to resurrect. Your grandfather and his associates are all long dead. Their victims are beyond justice, and their crimes are beyond redemption. Let their sins die with them, or risk destroying innocent descendants who bear no responsibility for the choices of their ancestors." But Martha Rutledge possessed a moral courage that her grandfather had fatally lacked. Despite Pemberton's warnings and her own family's desperate pleas to let the past remain buried, she insisted that the documents be preserved and eventually made available to historians. She had them transferred to the Charleston Historical Society with the stipulation that they remain sealed for 50 years, believing that the truth, however terrible, would eventually demand its due. What Martha didn't know was that the documents hidden in her grandfather's mansion were not the only evidence of Thornfield's dark activities. Her decision to preserve the papers would trigger a series of discoveries that would prove her grandfather's participation in the Covenant of Solomon was only the beginning of a conspiracy that had infected Charleston's elite like a spiritual plague. In 1893, 4 years after Martha's discovery, construction of a new public building on the site of Charleston's old slave market unearthed physical evidence that corroborated the most disturbing implications of the hidden papers. The slave market had been closed since 1863, and the building had stood empty for 30 years, slowly deteriorating in Charleston's humid climate until the city finally decided to demolish it and construct a new municipal building on the site. Workmen digging the foundation discovered that the old market building was only the visible portion of a much larger complex. Beneath the main floor was an extensive network of underground chambers that had been carved from the native stone and carefully bricked to create rooms that bore no resemblance to the storage areas one might expect to find under a commercial building. These chambers showed clear signs of recent use, despite the market's official closure 3 decades earlier. The walls bore stains that experienced men recognized immediately as blood. Not the small amounts that might result from accident or injury, but quantities that spoke of deliberate violence. Iron shackles still hung from rings bolted into the stone walls, their surfaces worn smooth by the struggles of countless victims. But it was the discovery of personal effects in the deepest chamber that sent chills through the investigation team and confirmed the worst fears raised by the Rutledge documents. Among the items recovered were a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials E.T. and the Latin inscription Tempus Mortis, time of death. The watch was immediately identified by elderly parishioners as the timepiece Reverend Thornfield had consulted obsessively during his final days in Charleston. Also found was a silver communion cup bearing the seal of St. Bartholomew's Church, its surface stained with substances that the city's medical examiner preferred not to identify in his official report. Most disturbing of all was a collection of daguerreotype photographs showing 13 men in ceremonial robes standing around what appeared to be an altar constructed from human bones. The city's response to these discoveries was swift, decisive, and clearly coordinated at the highest levels of government. Mayor Thomas Bennett, whose own family name appeared in the Rutledge documents, personally ordered that the chambers be filled with concrete before any detailed investigation could be conducted. The construction proceeded on an accelerated schedule, and within 6 months, the new Charleston municipal building stood atop whatever secrets lay buried beneath. However, the construction workers had not been sworn to secrecy, and rumors began circulating through Charleston's working-class neighborhoods with the speed and virulence of yellow fever. The stories grew more detailed and disturbing with each telling, as men who had worked in those underground chambers shared what they had seen with wives who whispered to neighbors who confided in friends until all of Charleston hummed with barely suppressed horror. Thomas McKenna, an Irish stoneworker who had helped excavate the chambers, began drinking heavily after the discovery, spending his wages in taverns along the waterfront, where he would regale anyone who would listen with increasingly wild accounts of what they had found. McKenna had worked construction in Boston and New York before coming to Charleston, and he claimed he had never seen anything that compared to the deliberate evil that had been practiced in those underground rooms. 13 bodies, he would whisper, his voice slurred with whiskey and terror, his hands shaking as he tried to light another cigarette. 13 poor souls, black and white alike, arranged in a perfect circle around that damned altar like they was participating in some sort of prayer meeting. But this wasn't no Christian gathering, I can tell you that. The way they was positioned, the things that had been done to them before they died. It was like something from the depths of hell itself. McKenna's accounts might have been dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized drunk, except for one disturbing detail that proved prophetic and connected his claims to the Rutledge documents. He insisted that the bodies were arranged according to a specific pattern, with 12 victims forming a circle around a 13th figure who was dressed in the black robes of a clergyman. "But here's the thing that'll haunt me to my grave," McKenna would continue, his voice dropping to barely a whisper as he leaned closer to his drinking companions. "That preacher in the center wasn't killed like the others. No, sir. That devil died with a smile on his face and his hands folded in prayer, like he was welcoming whatever dark angel had come to collect his soul. And the knife. Jesus preserve us. The knife was still in his own hands." McKenna's description matched exactly the membership roster found in Dr. Rutledge's papers. 13 members of the Covenant of Solomon, with Thornfield as their leader. But his account suggested something even more horrifying than mass murder. That Thornfield had orchestrated his own death as the culminating sacrifice of whatever dark pact he had made with forces beyond human understanding. The implications were staggering and reached far beyond a simple case of murder or suicide. Had Thornfield convinced 12 of Charleston's most powerful men to participate in his ritual death? Were they willing accomplices in his final ceremony, or had they become his victims in some twisted climax to years of blackmail and manipulation? And if the underground chambers truly contained evidence of systematic murder spanning years, how many of Charleston's missing slaves and poor whites had actually fallen victim to the Covenant's bloody rituals? As word of McKenna's claims spread through Charleston's underground networks of servants, dock workers, and free blacks who had long suspected that something sinister lurked beneath the city's genteel facade, a pattern emerged that chilled those brave enough to investigate. Church records from St. Bartholomew's showed that beginning in 1854, the same year the Covenant of Solomon was established, significant donations had been made to fund what was described as special ministry to Charleston's unfortunate population. The ministry, overseen personally by Thornfield and administered through a committee that included Dr. Rutledge, Judge Crenshaw, and Cornelius Fitzhugh, claimed to provide aid to runaway slaves, destitute immigrants, and others who existed on the margins of Charleston society. The records showed that substantial funds were allocated for housing, feeding, and spiritual guidance for these unfortunates, with detailed accounting that suggested a well-organized charitable operation. But city records told a very different story that painted this supposed charity in the darkest possible light. During the same period that St. Bartholomew's was claiming to help Charleston's most vulnerable populations, disappearances among these groups had increased dramatically. The police reports, filed but rarely investigated due to the low social status of the missing persons, documented dozens of cases that fit a disturbing pattern. The missing were invariably young adults between the ages of 18 and 30, both male and female, with no family connection strong enough to demand justice when they vanished. They were runaway slaves seeking freedom in the North, Irish immigrants who had arrived in Charleston with nothing but hope, free blacks whose lack of documentation made them easy targets, and poor whites whose disappearance would cause no disruption to Charleston's social order. Most unnervingly, several of the missing persons had last been seen in the company of well-dressed gentlemen who claimed to represent charitable organizations offering assistance. Witnesses described these benefactors as refined, educated men who spoke with the authority of those accustomed to being obeyed. Descriptions that could have applied to any member of Charleston's elite, including the known participants in Thornfield's covenant. The pattern became even more disturbing when cross-referenced with the dates noted in Thornfield's ritual calendar found among the Rutledge documents. Every disappearance coincided with what Thornfield had marked as covenant obligations or sacred works, suggesting that the missing persons had been specifically selected and acquired for whatever ceremonies the group conducted in those underground chambers. Dr. Magnus Steinberg, a German physician who had immigrated to Charleston in 1855 and who treated the city's poor population, had grown increasingly troubled by the pattern of disappearances. In letters to his brother in Hamburg, Steinberg wrote that he suspected something far more sinister than simple crime was behind the vanishings. The missing persons share characteristics that suggest deliberate selection rather than random predation, he wrote in December 1855. They are uniformly healthy, young, and without social connections that would trigger extensive searches. More disturbing still, several patients who sought my services reported being approached by representatives of charitable organizations that I have been unable to verify actually exist. I fear that Charleston's facade of Christian charity may conceal appetites far darker than mere greed or lust. Steinberg's concerns proved prophetic when he himself disappeared in February 1856, just 6 months before Thornfield's own vanishing. His body was never found, but his medical bag was discovered floating in Charleston Harbor, with a note suggesting that depression over his inability to help his patients had driven him to suicide. However, those who knew Steinberg well found this explanation unconvincing. He had been a man of deep faith and strong moral convictions who had spoken often of his obligation to serve those whom society had abandoned. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in the most unexpected way, through the conscience of a dying man who had carried the weight of terrible knowledge for nearly half a century. In the winter of 1901, 45 years after Thornfield's disappearance, Samuel Fletcher lay on his deathbed in a Charleston charity ward, consumed by tuberculosis and an even more consuming guilt that had poisoned his soul for decades. Fletcher had been a night watchman at the old slave market during the 1850s, a position that had given him access to parts of the building that most citizens never saw and had made him witness to activities that no Christian soul should ever have to endure. As death approached with inexorable certainty, he summoned Father Patrick McGrath, the Irish priest who ministered to Charleston's poor and dispossessed, and unburdened himself of secrets that had haunted his dreams and poisoned his waking hours for nearly 5 decades. "Father," Fletcher wheezed, his voice barely audible above the rattle in his chest and the moans of other dying men in the charity ward. "I've got to tell someone before I meet my maker. I've been carrying the devil's own secrets, and it's time for the truth to see the light of day, even if it damns me in the telling." What Fletcher revealed in that stinking charity ward, surrounded by the forgotten and abandoned of Charleston society, shattered any remaining illusions about Thornfield's disappearance and exposed a conspiracy so vast and evil that it had corrupted some of the most powerful families in the South. The Reverend had not vanished mysteriously. He had died by his own hand in a ritual specifically designed to cement his followers' loyalty through shared guilt and to bind their souls to his through the ultimate act of spiritual corruption. According to Fletcher's deathbed confession, delivered in whispered fragments over the course of 3 nights, as his life slowly ebbed away, he had been approached by Dr. Rutledge in the summer of 1855 with an offer that seemed too good to refuse. Fletcher was paid the substantial sum of $50 per month, more than most skilled laborers earned in Charleston, to provide access to the slave market's underground storage areas during night hours and to ensure that no one else observed the activities that took place there. Initially, Fletcher believed the space was being used for illegal slave trading, a practice that, while morally reprehensible, was common enough throughout the South that he could rationalize his cooperation for the generous payment he received. The money allowed him to support his ailing wife and to send his children to school, luxuries that his watchman's salary could never have provided. The reality was far worse than anything his limited imagination could have conceived. Beginning in early 1855 and continuing until Thornfield's death in August 1856, Fletcher witnessed the systematic torture and murder of at least 37 victims in the chambers beneath the slave market. The killings followed an elaborate ritual pattern that grew more complex and more horrifying with each ceremony. The participants wore black robes and masks that concealed their identities, but Fletcher's position as watchman required him to unlock the building for their arrival, and he gradually learned to recognize several by their voices, mannerisms, and physical characteristics. Dr. Rutledge was identifiable by his medical bag and his habit of checking each victim's pulse before and after the rituals. Judge Crenshaw carried a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be legal documents related to each victim. Cornelius Fitzhugh always arrived carrying a wooden case that contained the ceremonial implements used in the killings. But it was Thornfield himself who orchestrated each ceremony with the precision of a master conductor directing a symphony of death. He would arrive last, dressed in elaborate robes that bore symbols Fletcher had never seen before, carrying a leather-bound book from which he would read incantations in languages that seemed to make the very air tremble with malevolent power. The rituals themselves defied description in their calculated cruelty and spiritual perversion. Each victim was prepared according to specific requirements that Thornfield outlined from his ceremonial book. Some were kept alive for days while being systematically tortured. Others were killed quickly but with precise wounds that followed patterns dictated by whatever dark scripture guided the Covenant's actions. They wasn't just killing them, Fletcher gasped to Father McGrath, his eyes wide with remembered horror. They was harvesting something from them, something that weren't blood or flesh, but something deeper, something that made the very air in them chambers feel thick with evil. Fletcher described how Thornfield would position himself at the center of each ritual, directing the other participants with the authority of a high priest conducting sacred rites. As each victim died, Thornfield would collect their blood in silver chalices and force the other Covenant members to drink, binding them further to whatever dark purpose drove their activities. But the final ceremony, conducted on the night of August 23, 1856, was different from all the others in ways that still made Fletcher's voice shake with terror 45 years later. Instead of bringing a victim from outside, the robed figures had brought Reverend Thornfield himself to serve as the culminating sacrifice of their unholy covenant. Rather than being killed against his will, however, Thornfield had orchestrated his own death as the final act of whatever dark drama he had been directing for 2 years. He stood at the altar that had been built from the bones of their previous victims and delivered what Fletcher could only describe as a sermon, a twisted perversion of Christian theology that promised his followers power over life and death in Charleston, but only if they completed the ritual exactly as he commanded. He told them 12 devils, Fletcher whispered, his voice growing weaker as the effort of confession drained his remaining strength, that his sacrifice would bind their souls to his for all eternity. Said his death would give them dominion over Charleston's spiritual and temporal power, but only if they was willing to take up the knife themselves and send him to whatever master he served. Fletcher watched in horror as the 12 remaining Covenant members took turns driving the ceremonial dagger into Thornfield's heart, each thrust accompanied by words in that strange language that seemed to make the underground chambers shake with supernatural force. But rather than crying out in pain or showing fear, Thornfield smiled throughout the ordeal, his eyes fixed on something beyond the physical world that filled him with unholy joy. His final words, spoken as his lifeblood drained away onto the altar of human bones, were a promise that chilled Fletcher's soul. "Through my death, you achieve immortality. Through my sacrifice, you transcend the laws of God and man. We are bound now by blood and darkness until the end of time itself." The 12 remaining Covenant members disposed of Thornfield's body by placing it at the center of their previous victims, arranging the corpses in a pattern that Fletcher recognized from the symbols carved into the chamber walls. They then scattered to the four winds, never to gather again as a group, but bound forever by their participation in murder, sacrilege, and whatever spiritual corruption Thornfield had promised them. Fletcher's journal, which he had hidden in the walls of his tenement apartment and which Father McGrath recovered after the old man's death, contained detailed accounts of each ceremony he had witnessed. The entries, written in a shaky hand that reflected his limited education but absolute terror, included names of victims, descriptions of ritual implements, and most damning of all, the real names of all 13 Covenant participants. Father McGrath faced an agonizing decision as he sat in his small rectory. Fletcher's journal spread before him like evidence of humanity's capacity for ultimate evil. He could expose the truth and destroy the reputations of families whose descendants still wielded enormous power in Charleston and throughout the South. Or he could preserve the peace by allowing the dead to keep their secrets buried with their bones. The implications of Fletcher's revelations extended far beyond Charleston's city limits. Senator Barnwell's descendants had built a political dynasty that included governors, congressmen, and federal judges. The Rutledge medical fortune had grown into one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the South. Judge Crenshaw's legal legacy had influenced South Carolina's constitution and legal precedents that still governed the state's courts. After 3 sleepless nights of prayer and contemplation, Father McGrath chose a path that honored both justice and mercy while protecting innocent descendants from the sins of their ancestors. He turned Fletcher's journal over to the Catholic Church's archives in Baltimore with instructions that it be sealed for 50 years. But he also quietly began his own investigation, using church connections throughout the South to trace the fates of the Covenant survivors and their descendants. What he discovered over the following decade confirmed Fletcher's most disturbing claims and revealed that Thornfield's final promise had been fulfilled in ways that transcended rational explanation. The families of the 12 Covenant members had indeed prospered beyond any reasonable expectation following Thornfield's death, but their success had come at a price that proved more terrible than any material gain could justify. The Rutledge family had parlayed Dr. Edmund's medical practice into vast real estate holdings, pharmaceutical investments, and financial interests that made them one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. But prosperity had been accompanied by a hereditary curse of guilt and madness that manifested in every generation. Suicide rates among Rutledge descendants were nearly 10 times the national average, with family members killing themselves at ages that corresponded exactly to significant dates in the Covenant's ritual calendar. Judge Crenshaw's sons had built a legal dynasty that dominated South Carolina politics for 3 generations, producing governors, senators, and Supreme Court justices whose influence shaped Southern law for decades. But the family line was plagued by alcoholism, mental illness, and a pattern of early deaths that doctors could never adequately explain. Family records, which Father McGrath accessed through legal contacts, showed that Crenshaw descendants frequently died on August 23rd, the anniversary of Thornfield's sacrifice. The Fitzhugh tobacco fortune had grown into one of the largest mercantile empires in the South, with business interests extending from Charleston to Liverpool to Hong Kong. But the family's success was overshadowed by a pattern of mysterious disappearances that affected every generation. Fitzhugh descendants would simply vanish without explanation, usually around their 30th birthday. leaving behind successful businesses and loving families with no indication of why they had abandoned everything. Most disturbing of all were the private papers and diaries of Covenant descendants, which Father McGrath accessed through his ministerial connections with families throughout the South. These documents revealed a pattern of inherited guilt and terror that seemed to pass from parent to child like a genetic disease, affecting even those who had never been told the truth about their ancestors' crimes. Dr. Edmund Rutledge III, the grandson of the original Covenant member, had spent his adult life researching his family's history in a desperate attempt to understand why his bloodline seemed cursed with madness and early death. His private journal, discovered after his suicide in 1903, revealed the depth of spiritual torment that had consumed him. The sins of the fathers are visited upon the children unto the third and fourth generation, but I begin to understand that our curse extends far beyond biblical punishment. We are bound by blood to a covenant we never made, enslaved by a sacrifice we never witnessed, damned by choices we never had the opportunity to refuse. The dreams that plague my sleep are not mere nightmares, but memories inherited from grandfather's guilt. I see the chambers, smell the blood, hear the screams of innocents whose deaths purchased our family's prosperity. May God forgive what we cannot change and grant peace to souls we cannot save. Similar entries appeared in the personal writings of descendants from all 12 Covenant families, suggesting that Thornfield's ritual had created some form of spiritual inheritance that bound future generations to the guilt of their ancestors' crimes. Children who had never been told about the Covenant still suffered from nightmares about underground chambers and bloody altars. They experienced inexplicable terror on August 23rd each year, often becoming violently ill or suffering psychological breaks that required medical intervention. Even more disturbing were reports from family physicians who had treated multiple generations of Covenant descendants. Dr. James Morrison, who had served as the Rutledge family physician for 40 years, noted in his confidential medical records that every member of the family displayed identical symptoms of what he termed hereditary spiritual trauma. They suffered from night terrors that began in early childhood, experienced auditory and visual hallucinations involving religious imagery, and showed an abnormal fear of churches and religious ceremonies. It is as though the family bloodline carries within it some form of spiritual poison that manifests in each generation. Dr. Morrison wrote in his private notes, "The symptoms are too consistent and too specific to be explained by normal medical science. I have begun to suspect that certain sins create wounds in the human soul that can be passed from parent to child like any other inherited trait." By 1910, several of the original Covenant family lines had died out entirely, their last descendants either committing suicide, disappearing mysteriously, or dying young from illnesses that physicians could not diagnose or treat. Those families that survived did so only by leaving Charleston permanently and changing their names, attempting to break whatever spiritual chains bound them to Thornfield's legacy. The truth about Reverend Elias Thornfield's disappearance died with the last of the Covenant's direct descendants in the 1920s, but the evidence of their crimes remains sealed in archives across the country, waiting for future generations to uncover. The chambers beneath Charleston's municipal building were never fully excavated, their secrets buried beneath tons of concrete and the weight of deliberate forgetting. But the spiritual corruption that Thornfield unleashed on Charleston did not die with his covenant. Father McGrath's investigation revealed that the pattern of disappearances among the city's vulnerable populations had continued sporadically throughout the decades following 1856, suggesting that Thornfield's methods had inspired imitators, or that some aspect of his dark work had achieved the immortality he promised. Modern Charleston tourists who visit the municipal building often report strange experiences. Cold spots that seem to move through the structure like invisible presences, the sound of voices speaking in unknown languages rising from beneath the floors, and most disturbing of all, the overwhelming sense that something malevolent watches them from the shadows, hungry for the kind of spiritual corruption that once fed on the souls of the innocent. The building's security guards, who work the night shift alone in the structure, have reported hearing what sounds like ceremonial chanting emanating from the basement levels. Several guards have quit after experiencing what they describe as waking nightmares while on duty. Visions of robed figures conducting rituals in underground chambers, the screams of victims echoing through empty halls, and the overwhelming presence of an evil so pure and focused that it seems to drain the very life from the air around it. Sometimes, on humid August nights, when the air hangs heavy over Charleston's historic district like a funeral shroud, residents report strange sounds emanating from beneath the municipal building. The echo of voices raised in unnatural prayer, the scrape of metal on stone that might be ceremonial daggers being sharpened for unholy work, and most disturbing of all, the sound of laughter that seems to rise from the very depths of hell itself, as though Elias Thornfield still conducts his dark symphony from whatever realm claims the souls of those who trade their humanity for temporal power. This mystery shows us how the pursuit of power and the corruption of faith can create evils that echo through generations, poisoning entire bloodlines with inherited guilt and supernatural terror. The true horror of Thornfield's covenant was not just the murders they committed or the innocent lives they destroyed, but the spiritual darkness they unleashed on their descendants, binding future generations to sins they had never committed and creating a legacy of madness and death that proved more enduring than any material wealth they accumulated through their crimes. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried beneath Charleston's genteel facade? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in a historic building that left you wondering what tragedies might have occurred there decades or centuries ago? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened in those underground chambers. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The past never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to claw its way back to the surface, reminding us that some sins are too great to be forgiven and some evils too pure to ever truly die. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark chapter from America's hidden history.
Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.